Welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our special author guest is Father George Rutler, author of Stories of Hymns, the history behind 100 of Christianity's greatest hymns, published by EWTN Publishing. And it's great to see you, Father George, joining us there from New York City, where you're the pastor at St. Michael's Parish in New York City. Thank you so much for finding the time to join us here on Bookmark. Great to see you.
Well, thank you, Doug. I'm glad we can do this.
Exactly. And, you know, many people are familiar with you for many, many years here on EWTN. I know your earliest series, I believe, was done back in '92. Today, with Father Rutler, you've done multiple series, some shot in the studios here for years and then others up in New York City. When was the first time you were actually at EWTN, and what brought you here?
I remember exactly. It was 1987. And so 30 years. And I remember that well because I was doing a graduate degree at that time in England, and I did a television program there on their Midlands Television, whose studios are in Birmingham. Mm-hmm. And that same week I came back to the United States for a Lenten talk on EWTN. Mother Angelica, for some reason, knew about me, got hold of me, and that was her invitation. So I'm certain I am the only person ever to have done two television programs in the two Birminghams in 1 week.
Right.
When I came to the airport, I was in Atlanta airport, I was getting the connecting flight, and I asked the man where the flight was to Birmingham, and he said, Birmingham.
Right.
I didn't tell him that the real Birmingham is not Birmingham, yeah. But anyway, that's how I got going. It's been 30 years.
Right. So, and you've been writing books for a number of years now. This book itself was originally published in 1998 by Ignatius Press under the title Brightest and Best Stories of Hymns. And actually, I remember it as well because I'm sure we did a book interview at the time when the show first started, and we did a series that I remember you did for us in the studios here, actually, where you displayed some of your alacrity with the piano, right?
Right. And since then, I've also taken up the violin unsuccessfully. I sound terrible. Violin is harder to start learning than piano, actually. Piano gets harder later on. Mm-hmm. But at least I've noticed that the pigeons on my front steps of my church fly away when I'm practicing. So I have some use for my talent there. That series once in a while reappears. I've noticed that
Mm-hmm.
EWTN. I know at Christmas,
right,
showed some of the Christmas hymns. So I feel like was that film It's a Wonderful Life, Jimmy Stewart, that they show every Christmas. So that was rather a while ago.
Right. So we have this particular book, and now it was published back then. Now we're almost 20 years later from when it was originally published, amazingly, and since when we first did the series. Now you've got a preface in here. Is that the same preface? Is it basically the same book we had before? How has it changed, if at all?
It's basically the same. Slight adjustment to keep up with the time, but. The purpose, what I'm saying in the preface, is that we have to understand this great gift that the Church has, the patrimony of her song. The liturgy itself is a song. In classical Judaism, prayers are not said; they're sung. To pray is to sing. St. Augustine says that the one who sings prays twice, qui cantat bis orat. The liturgy is only by exception said. The normative celebration is sung. Hymns, the classical hymn book of the church, of course, is the Book of Psalms. And in fact, some of the Psalms, called the Psalms of Ascent, from 120 to 132, actually, if you have instructions for the musicians, hymnos means for the Greek, a song that's accompanied by instruments. And the church, Pope Pius X wrote very careful instructions on the reform of music, because in his day, that is really through the 19th century, liturgical music had become very decadent. The popular form of music at that time was opera. Great. Opera is great in the opera house, but a lot of the liturgical music became very operatic. And he wanted to emphasize the importance of the text over music, and that's why he tried to revive, not with great success, Gregorian chant. The monks of Solesmes Abbey in France did a great deal of work to cooperate with that Gregorian revival. And the Second Vatican Council speaks of music as the highest of the church's arts, and is very careful about the primacy of Gregorian chant. It's quite remarkable how people have ignored those instructions. So, unfortunately, now in the celebration of the Mass, very often the Mass is said and a few hymns are stuck in. Well, what we call hymns now are really what in the Middle Ages would have been tropes, that is, a commentary on the liturgy, but they don't become the liturgy. We have what some people call a hymn sandwich, with a hymn at the beginning, a hymn at the end, and a hymn in the middle at the offertory. That is not what the liturgy is supposed to be. The liturgy itself should be chanted. And I think we can learn a great deal from the Eastern rites in that regard.
Well, let me ask you, you right in the preface you say, you talk about hymns, the idea of the hymn as an individual composition distinct from the church's official collective prayer has always been susceptible to aesthetic lapses. And you go to quote, C.S. Lewis complained that most hymns are fifth-rate poetry set to fourth-rate music. And you talk about the banality of our liturgical life. Now, this is 20 years ago. Is it getting better, getting worse, or about the same?
Well, I mean, he probably would have had a breakdown if he could have seen what passes for liturgical music in the last couple generations. I think almost all hymnody, or pseudo-hymnody, written since the 1960s is totally to be disregarded, pathetic, committing not only offenses against the canons of good music and good verse, but indulging that decadent substitute for authentic worship, which is sentimentality. Now, one cannot say that this is new. For centuries, there have been indulgences of drippy, syrupy, sentimental music. But because of the rubrics, up until recently, that music was not very much common in the actual Mass. You have to remember, too, that we have other forms of worship besides the Holy Eucharist. We have the daily office, which is supposedly supposed to be sung. The daily office, the breviary, uses the Church's hymn book, the Psalms. And we also are encouraged just to sing in formal devotion. We have been afflicted in recent times with a very passive approach to music. People listen to things on their iPods and that. I think we have a whole generation growing up now that doesn't know how to sing. When people say, why don't people sing in church? Well, how many people sing any place? One reason, of course, is that pop music now is virtually unsingable. But many of us grew up in families where at night we sing around the piano. And we would learn from our parents and our grandparents. I mean, when I was a child, I learned music from the 19th century because that's when my grandparents had been born. And it seemed very much part of the normal repertoire. But as with a certain kind of cultural isolationism today, which ignores anything in the past, there is a large ignorance of music that's gone before. And I'm not talking just about 100 years ago. I mean, I have college students who've asked me who was Frank Sinatra.
Right, okay. Yes, that's certainly a limited historical perspective there, even for some of our young people today, but I guess not overly surprising if we think in terms of history not being very important to most people today at all.
I had the advantage of, because I was brought up an Anglican, and music is very much a part of that cultural tradition. Culturally, it's as important as theologically. I've noticed, for instance, there are certain cultures which seem more adaptable to music. For instance, Wales, maybe up until just recently, has had a long, long singing tradition. Coal miners having choral groups. I was in Australia and I got to know quite a few seminarians who were there from Samoa. And from the age of 2 or 3, they're singing a cappella.
Okay.
They took many of the tribal songs and they adapted it to the liturgy. Ethereal. So it very much helps to be brought up in a tradition which encourages that. And I was brought up that way. I had a terrible voice, but I was...
You were a choir boy, though,
lacking
right, in the 50s, right?
I was. Oh, yes, I was a choir boy.
Right.
It was great training. And I grew up with very, very fine hymns. And to this day, I can still identify music, hymns by the number they were given and what was then called the 1940 hymnal. So in this book on hymns,
Right.
I was rather arbitrary. My standard was the ones I like, which I found a pretty reliable standard. And some of them might be borderline clunkers, but to that I had a certain sentimental attachment to them. Nothing wrong with sentimentality in a good sense.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that too, because you say here, and you kind of alluded to it earlier, you say, only because I was familiar with most of these hymns from an early age was I able years ago to take offense at the bowdlerization by clumsy editors and ideologues. I came to notice that in almost every instance of updating, solid theology was the victim. References to sacrifice, grace, sin, spiritual combat, and Christ's blood were replaced by insistence on kindness, altruism, and social enlightenment.
There are many hymns in the evangelical tradition, or the Anglican tradition, for instance, or the Lutheran tradition, which in their original forms are doctrinally sound and much stronger than a lot of what passes for modern Catholic hymns. I mean, going John Milton, Isaac Watts, the Charles and John Wesley, very strong hymns. And I would notice sometimes with singing these hymns, something had been changed. Look back, yes, sin, judgment, blood,
sacrifice
omitted,
or something like that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so these hymns were watered down to become kind of homogenized and also offensively transgendered. And we don't do that to Shakespeare. We should not allow that in these hymns. Now, the church realized how bad the first vernacular translations of the Novus Ordo, or the ordinary form of the liturgy, were. And so it was somewhat somewhat improved, but that's not happened to much of our hymns. The original edition of this book was called Brightest and Best, because that was the opening line of one of my favorite hymns by an Anglican missionary bishop in the early 19th century, Reginald Heber. It's an Epiphany hymn, Brightest and Best of the Sons of the Morning. There was a political book in the 1960s which got it wrong. It was called Best and Brightest. So usually people use that term now, best and brightest. But
that was supposed to be on the Kennedy administration, wasn't it? They kind of called them the best and the brightest. That was the whole thing, right?
Yes, and that's not the only thing they got backwards.
Right.
But it's brightest and best. And read those words. They're transportingly beautiful. And it was, well, I don't think there are many coincidences in life. There's providence. And I got, at one point, I just did these as a meditation, one a day. And after a while, I said, well, that's enough. And after the manuscript was put together, they were exactly 100. I didn't plan it that way.
You didn't? Okay.
And the day I finished, I went for a walk, and I went into a local bookshop uptown here in Manhattan. And there, they had a sale on engravings, and there right on the top of the package was an engraving of Reginald Heber.
Oh, really? Okay.
Now, it's the first time I'd ever seen a picture of him, so I took that as some kind of
sign,
celestial mark of approval.
Well, let me ask you, because there's a couple of great, interesting quotes you have in here before we talk about some of the hymns. You say, selfish ambition has been called the lust of the cleric, so is sentimentalism the indulgence of the cruel. What do you mean by that?
Well, sentimentalism is empty love. It's love without an object. It's feeling rather than fact. Love requires sacrifice, an offering of the self to another. Sentimentality is self-indulgence. Sentiment is important, but sentimentality is rather like what rationalism is to reason. Reason is to enable us to figure out the truth. Rationalism is a misuse of reason to avoid the truth. And so that syrupy kind of sentimentality of which I speak is a substitute. It's love, as I said, love without sacrifice, self-indulgence. And this is why, significantly, it hesitates to talk about the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, on redemption, on judgment, on sin, and glory.
Right.
Sentimentality doesn't have space for glory, real glory.
Now, one of the things I also know about your parish is that you've actually got a fairly strong youth attendance and I don't want to call it a youth group, but a young people's group there. And one of the things you mentioned in the book that I thought kind of related to that was, besides the fact of talking about muzak and stone, referring to the architecture of certain churches, but you say it is the spectacle of an aged man trying to impress the young with jargon he does not realize is already out of date.
Well, there was a deaning in the early 20th century, who was Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, who said that if you try to keep up with the times, you will be a widower in the next. In other words, nothing goes out of fashion more quickly than fashion. Of course, we have to interpret the unchanging truths of the church in language that people will understand, but we don't change the truth. Otherwise, the tail wags the dog. And I think young people are really, they're countercultural when they practice the Catholic faith, certainly in our secularizing society, and they want something substantial. They don't want to be patronized by clergymen who are self-consciously trying to be young or
Relevant.
fit the
Right.
a mode of youth.
Right. Well, let me ask you, in putting the book together, the way you laid it out, you said you lay it out chronologically rather than seasonally. For what particular purpose?
To get a sense of how the church's language to express in a ludic, musical way develops, but draws on the past. So many of the later hymns are translations or redactions or adaptations of early hymns. We read it. I mean, St. Paul uses hymns. You look in some of his epistles, it's very clear he goes into verse. So from the very earliest days, the Christians sang. They sang a hymn at the Last Supper. There's an art to translation. Mm-hmm. And some of the great hymns of the 18th and 19th century were the work of classically trained translators. Probably the best, I think, was Anglican clergyman John Mason Neale, who knew his Hebrew, he knew his Greek, and he knew his Latin. He was even able to replicate the meter. But you mentioned architecture before. Architecture is being called music in stone. And our sense of music affects architecture and vice versa. I look at the great Gregorian music of the Middle Ages and see also the Gothic architecture. Both are transcendent. I was interested to see, just in this last week or so, a cardinal in the Curia, who has responsibilities for cultural affairs, lamented the number of ugly churches that have been built in the last generation in Italy. This is politically incorrect to say, but is obviously right. But what does that mean when we build a church that looks like a parking garage? The sense of the transcendent is abandoned, and also the ego of the architect takes preeminence. Right. He wants to be unique, he wants to be inventive, he wants to call attention to himself. The classical architects did not do that. They were lost in their art. And the same thing with great music.
Music, okay. Let me ask you too, in going through the 100 you have here, the one thing that struck me as not being highly knowledgeable about the history of hymnody in the church or in Christianity in general is the ones I recognize the most here. There's several from like Christmas that we still sing. O come, Emmanuel, a little town of Bethlehem, O come all ye faithful. And then also, I guess, coming up on Easter, which we're going to be coming up in the next couple of months, is Jesus Christ is risen today. So it's interesting that those probably are the most familiar hymns that are featured in here that show up because of Christmas and Easter.
Well, and for people who only go to church at Christmas and Easter,
it's perfect
course,
for them. You're right.
But some of the Christmas and Easter hymns really weren't written just for that season. I would say that the great Easter hymns are based on old monastic hymns. And even go back to sub-apostolic times. Two of the first hymns we had, at least canonized to be sung, were the Gloria and the Agnus Dei. And you had two popes, Symmachus and Sergius, who mandated their use in the liturgy. And of course, 5th century, you find the creed being incorporated as a hymn. So many of these festal hymns of Christmas, Easter, Pentecost too, are from what we called sequences, earlier sequences, processional hymns.
Right. And you give some great background on the story behind how the hymns came to be. It's also interesting sometimes to realize how many times you don't think in terms of the music coming from one particular composer or from a traditional theme and then having the words married later. It's interesting how that process was actually accomplished.
The reforming popes, and I'm talking about with regard to music, paramount figure being St. Pius X, reminded the faithful that music must serve the words, so that we don't like hymns because of the music, because that means the music is distracting, taking over. A genius of Gregorian chant or plain chant is that the music serves the text.
Right. Well, thank you so much. It's great to see you. Hopefully we'll have some other material coming from you in the near future. We'll have you back here on Bookmark. I know you got a compilation of articles you've been writing over the years and some other books in the works. And just keep up standing up for Christ in the city. That'll be great. And it's great to see you again.
Well, thank you. And the next time you're in New York, we can have a hymn sing.
There we go, together. Thank you so much. The one and only Father George Rutler, live from New York City, talking to him about his book, The Stories of Hymns, the history behind 100 of Christianity's greatest hymns, by Father George William Rutler, published by EWTN proudly. Thank you so much. Available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. Join us next time on Bookmark. Thank you so much.